A very interesting area called Primrose Hill. A lot of people lived here. You're working here. Tell us about the neighborhood.
Primrose Hill, which is adjacent to the London Zoo, is the last of the London villages. London is formed of a multitude of little villages which are all joined up. But this one is the last to retain its personality. It's got no chain stores, it keeps out Starbucks, every shop is individually owned. The architecture is beautiful for the most part. Interesting people who lived here: Sylvia Plath, W.B. Yeats, Walter Sickert.
Sickert?
Yes, and
Engels.
And Friedrich Engels is the funniest one, because he is living here in apparent prosperity, while Marx is living down in Soho in appalling poverty, and he must keep coming up here for free meals, going to the pub across the road. It's fascinating to speculate.
And you said this is one of the few remaining areas like this in all of London.
Oh yes, absolutely. This is, as I say, the last village intact, and it's very expensive. Unbelievable. So it was very run down around here 40 years ago when I was young. You could have bought a house for probably about £14,000, and now I notice there's one up for 3.2 million.
Now your office, Photoplay Productions, has been here how long?
We moved here in 1990, so we've been here 17 years, but not for much longer, because television over here has lost interest in film history and the kind of documentary we make, and the Americans, who kept us going for a long time. The last we made for Turner Classic Movies was Garbo for her centenary, and Marion C. Cooper, I'm King Kong it was called, and we were doing these two big pictures at once for Turner, and we thought our future was made. But that was 2 years ago, and we have had nothing since. Mm-hmm. So I suspect our run is over, but we've had a marvelous time doing it. I can't believe it.
Well, I thought we could look back over a career in which you've done more, I think, than anyone on the planet to bring the silent film to new generations. But you've pointed up an irony. The resources are there, the venues are there, DVD technology is there with all the special features, television outlets are there. More silent films are being found and restored. But what's the disparity between that and our inability to make more movies about them and show them more?
I'm sure also the audience is there, but you have to get through the insuperable barriers of the commissioning editors. And the commissioning editors are largely people born born after David Gill and I made that series on Hollywood, and they simply do not have any interest, nor do they know who these people are. Yeah. And that is a grave drawback. After all, the majority of the viewing public are not the people that they're after, the under 25s. They're out having a good time, shooting themselves up, shooting each other. It's the older people who are staying at home, the retired people, and they do know the names, and they do want to see these things, and they can't stand the majority of what's on television, which is an insult to the human intelligence, I have to tell you. But what can you do about it?
Take us back through what you have seen of silent film scholarship and awareness since you wrote Parade's Gone By up to the present. We've kind of gone in waves, haven't we, of interest and availability of films, and then the technologies keep changing. You go back to, what, was it 11 or 12 millimeter?
No, 9.5 millimeter.
Yeah.
Yes.
From there to the DVD, you've seen silent films in every conceivable format.
I certainly have. And I tell you what, whenever there is a day in which you've just had a very quick thunderstorm and the sun has come out and everything looks ravishingly beautiful, my wife always says, "Oh, wonderful nitrate weather." And that's because she saw nitrate prints projected with carbon arc projectors, and there was nothing to beat that. However improved the quality of DVDs or high definition or whatever. You just cannot beat what that looked like. However, the saddest thing is that it was regarded as dangerous, and fire brigade insisted that you got rid of it. And it's no more dangerous than the petrol in your car. You don't open your petrol tank and drop a match down it, nor do you do that with nitrate. And we now know to our cost that had we kept the nitrate and in cool conditions, refrigerated conditions, it lasts forever. But archives and film companies threw it away. Some of them, even in Hollywood, they used to take it out in barges from Wilmington and San Pedro and dropped it over the side into the deep water. So it is a very sad lookout that many silent films are only represented by inadequate 16mm prints, not even good ones.
If they're represented at all.
If they're represented at all, yes.
Yeah.
But I started on 9.5, which was extremely exciting because some of the prints were taken from the camera negative and were of superb quality. Alas, they were nearly all abridged, but nevertheless they served as the most marvellous introduction and turned me on to become a passionate enthusiast for the silent era, which I still am, amazingly, after 50 years.
Contrast that now with the DVD availability now of, say, something like Fairbanks' Iron Mask. Looks great, music is great. Is that an advance over what we knew 40, 50 years ago?
I think that's what we were all longing for. Something that would be relatively cheap and available, which could be projected, which could be put on a television monitor, but which preserves the quality and the integrity of the original cinematography. But we now discover that if you get the slightest abrasion on a DVD, the damn thing's useless.
Yeah.
That wasn't the case with film. It got scratched, you could still run it. That wasn't the case with tape. And it wasn't going to be the case with DVDs. One of the selling points was they were indestructible. Do you remember that?
Right. Same with CDs.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Is it the same thing with CDs?
Well, that was the prediction.
Yeah.
The compact disc for sound would be forever.
But are they?
No. Well, the most horrendous noises result when there's marring of the surface. Oh, yeah.
So that is a cynical industrial method to make us buy more, I suppose, replace them, but they withdraw them so quickly you can't get hold of them.
But we have Carl Davis's score on that film.
Yes.
We hadn't had that before.
Yes, that's another thing. That why I say it's sort of utopian, because in my day you never got any music at all with the films, and you had to provide your own. And I've even heard people running old movies to a radio, switching the radio on. Do you want to tell that driver to help?
No, it's okay. Hardly any of that will show us. Yeah.
Okay.
In the meantime, what do you know now about silent film that you did not know then? In other words, it's a very fluid history. It's always changing, new things coming to light.
Well, I've just come back from the Bologna Film Festival, and every year they run a group of films made exactly 100 years ago. And this group was from 1907. Now this is the year before D.W. Griffith even got into the business. And I was absolutely amazed at the cinematic sophistication that these filmmakers showed so early on. Wonderful little mini features, extremely well directed and beautifully photographed. And honestly, far better than anything Griffith was doing in his early years. What's gone wrong with film history that we never knew about this?
Well, we've come a long way from Griffith inventing the close-up.
Yes. These all had close-ups in, by the way.
Yeah.
Yes. And cuts on action and moving camera and all sorts of things that you never thought they had. It's fascinating. What I learned at first, I thought all silent films were good, and I quickly learned from having made some unfortunate purchases that they made as many lousy films then as they do now. But there are so many important and outstanding films which have been ignored and thrown away, literally. That what I find tremendously exciting is to turn up an unknown title by an unknown director, which is brilliant. And there are masses of those. I'm constantly getting surprises. I remember William K. Everson feeling towards the end of his career that he'd seen everything, and he was getting a bit blasé and jaded. I never feel that. I'm constantly amazed. And I'm also amazed by this. I would get a film that I would be extremely disappointed by. I would put it at the bottom of a pile, forget all about it. In 10, 20 years' time, I'd look at it again, and it, like old wine, it's matured, and it's become really fascinating.
It wasn't that you got better, it got better.
It got better.
I'll be darned. Any examples of that?
Well, there's one called The Safety Curtain, which was a very minor woman's magazine type story which Norma Talmadge made in 1918 for Joe Skenk. That was about one of the very first amber prints, Kodascope tinted prints that I bought. It looks so beautiful. And her performance is marvelous. And it does work. It really does work. And I was thrilled with that, because I was really afraid it was going to be embarrassingly juvenile, but it isn't. It really works.
And have there been other bodies of work that you did not know about in 1968, but have since known about because of all of these discoveries year to year to year? Things that you just did not know in 1968 when you wrote Parade.
Well, God, so much.
Yeah.
It's yes. So many names of directors that Charles Brabin.
Right.
One of his films was thrown on in a rather dull Pordenone and really lifted it through the roof. The Valley of the Giants. Brilliant film. Borzegi. I'd never heard of Lucky Star. Somebody found it in Belgium and put it on. It's a masterpiece, which we never knew about. They keep coming up.
Well, we hear about people like Hobart Bosworth and King Baggett. Names that are only names.
And Rex Ingram, one of my pets. Somebody sent me a tape of an unidentified, they thought Austrian film, because they had German titles from an Austrian company. And it took me a long time to realize who'd made it, but it was in fact an early 1918, I think, Rex Ingram.
How have politics affected new findings? For example, since the fall of the Eastern Bloc countries, new archives, new findings, is that also affecting our sense of film history?
Not so much the East as, amazingly enough, Holland. The Dutch archive must have been run by people who were fast asleep, and a new regime took over, and they found amazing things, including many British pictures that we didn't know about, and they do the most wonderful colour prints so that you get the full glory. And that has shown up an awful lot, because archives always copied that in black and white and simply wrote down what the tints were. But when you see the glory of hand stenciling and full tinting, it's that's changed an awful lot.
Too, I'm thinking of all these, every time I turn around, something's found in the permafrost up in the Yukon. Unlikely places where prints are found, perfectly preserved.
Now, I know what I was going to say. The great tragedy is the copyright extension. Now, here is an example. Paramount Pictures made a film called Stark Love, which Carl Brown directed and North Carolina mountains with the mountain people. It was like a Robert Flaherty drama documentary. Paramount destroyed it. They had no further use for it. It was found in Czechoslovakia, brought back to the United States, and recently we've had the opportunity to consider making a documentary about it. So we contact Paramount, who destroyed it, remember? And they said, yes, by all means you can use it. That will be $6,000 a minute. It seems to me only just that if you didn't bother to keep the film, you shouldn't have the copyright on it. And the person who's made all the effort and spent all the money to find it should be allowed to do so. Copyright shouldn't enter into it. The people should be free to use these films as they would be free to use novels published in the 18th century. I think it is criminal, actually, how little the studios cared about film preservation. They spent a great deal more on lunch than they ever did on saving films.
So the Stark Love Project never...
Stark Love Project is not going to happen.
But you have interviewed Carl Brown, at least.
Yes.
I remember meeting him, too. How have you changed as an enthusiast and an historian and an oral historian? How have you changed since you first gathered together Parades Gone By to now in your attitudes, your knowledge of the silent film?
That's an awfully difficult question to answer. I have not thought about it. Have you
Certainly,
any idea?
Your enthusiasm is undiminished.
My enthusiasm is amazingly undiminished. I must say that's a tribute to the period. I still love those people. I get terribly excited in any sort of contact with that era.
Well, another way of putting it was, what were you like as a young man when you first gathered those interviews, as opposed to now?
I tell you one thing that's just struck me. I never would have believed in 1952, whenever it was, when I first saw my first 2 reels of Napoleon, that people would be so greedy that 50 years later they would be suing me for showing it without their permission in London. And yet, that's absolutely thrilling, because it just shows how seriously they take it. That they would be willing to spend thousands and thousands and thousands to prevent the British Film Institute and me showing the film that we made available to them. And
that's the situation now?
That's the situation now, yeah. And I've just heard that the film, the Coppola version, is being shown in Los Angeles, and they're making it out to be my latest restoration. In fact, it's the moth-eaten old thing that I did it 30 years ago.
What kind of a tribute to you is that?
That is very, very upsetting.
Yeah.
Because the latest version does look absolutely magnificent, and the version they're using from the 70s is moth-eaten, to put it mildly. But at the same time, the seriousness with which it's all taken, I wouldn't have believed it.
Let's go back to you as that young man. Did you have any idea what you were getting into when you first started doing those interviews, looking back? Were you fully aware of this huge study that you were embarking upon?
I used to get very depressed when I was working for the American Film Institute with the job of doing those interviews. I used to get terribly depressed because I could do so little, and there were so many people still about that I was having to bypass because there just wasn't time to include everyone. Now there's nobody.
So even the opportunity isn't there.
The opportunity isn't there, and now one has to interview people who are the next generation down, or who have seen something that has disappeared. But it's all so minor compared to. I remember also, on the other hand, when we were shooting with Thames with a full crew out in California, thinking this is like reaching a hand up into a tree and the fruit falling out of it. There's so much. They were so forthcoming. They were so colourful. There was so much information. You just didn't know where to stop.
Now, where is all of the interview material that was not used in those broadcasts?
We had a very progressive producer, Jeremy Isaacs,
Oh,
who
yes.
made The World at War. The first thing he said was he instructed an assistant editor to make a special print from the negative before the negative was cut, to put that with the sound into the National Film Archive. And that was a godsend. However, here we go back to
However,
now we go back to copyright again. The copyright is owned by a company called Fremantle, who have inherited the Thames product. And when we want to use anything of this, we have to pay them £3,000 a minute. And that's a special deal because I shot it. Now, then we go to the National Film Archive and say, can we have Henry Hathaway? Because we wanted him for, I can't remember, one of our documentaries. And when we got it, it looked as though a Sherman tank had been running over it for about a week. It was absolutely useless.
was the sound even there?
The sound was there, but the picture quality, the picture itself, had been severely damaged. Somebody must have laced it up incorrectly on some cockeyed viewer, and the result was disastrous. How many others
Yeah.
are like that?
Well, that was my next question.
And the other thing is, when it came to Chaplin and so on, we sent the interviews in, but there was no particular interest in what we sent them, and the sound has got parted from the picture. And they don't know where it is. I keep saying send whatever looks likely, and that's going to need identification and syncing up. Now, I'm not going to be around forever. If they don't take advantage of the fact that I'm around now, nobody else will be able to tell whose voice is who, what goes with what, and hundreds of interviews of people who worked with Chaplin, Keaton and Lloyd will be lost. And the British Film Institute is in a terrible state at the moment. That one would never believed. They're closing up Stephen Street and selling it and moving into this great complex they've got on the South Bank called the BFI South Bank Centre. And the Stills Library is being boxed up like the Museum of Modern Art was and sent down for research only.
Yeah.
So you go down there and you research and you say, that's the one I want, and they say, well, you can't have it. And the book library is being sold off to some university, except so far no university wants the responsibility. All the things that BFI ought to be doing, they're not doing. Or they're just putting on videotakes and mediatakes and installations and things like that, which is not what they were put there to do. They were put there to save the past of the cinema.
Back to those Thames interviews, they do exist, but for example, for every interview you did with, say, Blanche Sweet or somebody like that, you would have used only mere minutes of it. How much more of it exists?
Well, I remember with Alan Dwan,
Or with Dwan, yeah.
for instance, we used quite a lot of him in the program, but I wouldn't think it went above 5 minutes. But we actually shot 16 10-minute magazines.
So all of that,
Henry King, the same thing. We were so impressed we came back the next day and did some more. Some of them very little. William Wyler hadn't got much to say and wasn't terribly well, and we just shot 3 or 4 rolls on him.
well, at least were transcripts kept of all those?
Yes,
Well,
yes.
where are they?
I've got transcripts.
But still, the moving image,
Yeah,
you're fearful that more of them might be in the kind of condition you were talking about.
that really worries me. Yes.
Do you at least have access to go look at what's there? Fremantle, you said?
I suppose one could set up the operation going through 83 or however many interviews there are, but it would take months.
Yeah.
And you'd need to have a project to make it, to justify it.
Are there any enterprising scholars out there who could take that on?
Not that I know of, no.
Well, we started out with the idea that there's been a lot of developments in silent film research, and so far I'm hearing more about shortcomings.
Yes, and many of the films lost are lost by archives these days, which is very depressing, not just not looking after them. Some archives are simply warehouses. And I think the National Film Archive is going to be in that category very shortly if they don't sort it out.
Now, are you being an alarmist, or is this a realistic assessment?
No, this is a realistic assessment. It is astonishing how much interest in silent films has occurred in the last 25 years. That these festivals, which, for instance, I think Pordenone started with 7 guests, and the last one they had 700. So that is remarkable. But if you put on a silent film and expected to fill the theatre just because of what you were doing, it wouldn't happen. You really do have to deliver something special and advertise it properly. Mm-hmm. I remember when we did Old Heidelberg at the National Film Theatre, just put it on in the normal course of events, 25 people turned up. But when we did it with Carl Davis and the orchestra, 2,500 turned up at the festival hall.
Are there any more series like that occurring in and around London, of such presentations like that?
Not at the moment, not till April. The festival hall is going to do Ben-Hur. The most extraordinary one, over which I have very mixed feelings, was Battleship Potemkin, shown a couple of years ago in Trafalgar Square, free. And because the music was by a pop group called the Pet Shop Boys, they got 25,000 people. And it was in the rain, and they stayed there, and you couldn't put an umbrella up because people behind you shouted at you to take it down again. But it was an amazing event. Although, despite the shortcomings of the music, which was considerable, the film looked magnificent. And that again is the projectionists thought out how best to do it. And they took it off DVD, believe it or not, and it wasn't strong enough. So they had 3 video projectors coming off the same tape, the same DVD. So you got 3 times the brilliance, and it did look absolutely superb. It really did.
Kids were there for the music. Maybe they came away with the film.
That's what one hopes.
Yeah.
In fact, some people next to me said, I saw, years ago, I saw a picture called Napoleon that was showing like this. Yeah. I think television has let the side down tremendously, because there are so many channels. There's so much stuff, inferior stuff going out. It wouldn't kill them to give us 1 hour a week, an hour and a half, for a full restoration of a silent film with music. And we've just done The Godless Girl for Channel 4, and that's the last that they want.
You would think that since the days of Silence Please, there would have been such an expansion.
Yeah.
But now we look back upon Silence Please with nostalgia, because there was more of that then than there is now on television.
Yes, it was.
It's hideous.
In fact, you don't get black and white peak hours on television anymore, and certainly not those films which have little lettering down the bottom which you have to read.
When you look back at all of the projects you've been involved in, is it fair to ask you which one has been your favorite child that you are proudest to leave as a kind of legacy?
Well, certainly Napoleon. But of the documentaries, it would be very hard to choose one. And I suppose it would be Hollywood, because that was an occasion which will never come again. When we had people working on something which I thought I was going to be cured, like an alcoholic's cure, working for television on this subject, and I never want to touch it again. But David Gill turned out to be more rigorous than I was, and more caring about the films. I was just amazed.
How old were you then when
I did the Hollywood thing? 40, I suppose. 98, there would have been. Yeah, somewhere around late 30s and early 40s.
Can you remember how you were at that time? Can you remember the person you were at that point?
Yeah,
you know what I mean?
Yes, absolutely. Think, how long is this going to take? Everything is so slow. I can't bear that I'm not editing these personally. It's terribly difficult. But somehow we got through it. And somehow the result was really not bad at all.
But a lot of people haven't yet seen them.
That's true, and Fremantle have been considering bringing them out on DVD, and they keep announcing them, but they keep forgetting that years ago I warned them that there were rights outstanding, and they keep running into that, and they have to withdraw them. So they brought out, as I think you know, they brought out the Keaton on DVD, and they used the wrong master, and they have there's no identification for the interviews, and no identification for the films, and great holes where photographs should go. It's just simply awful. And in their defense, they said nobody in the reviews mentioned it.
But we have the Chaplain.
Yes, that worked all
with
right.
And special features, you and Frank Scheid and others.
Yeah, that. If only we could have done more like that.
That is something that, if you could pursue it, putting special features onto some of the projects that you've done over the years.
The trouble is, there's no time. It would never be the time or money to do it properly. But one should have replaced all the footage in the Hollywood series from start to finish, and it would have looked absolutely stunning. And then, of course, you've got the problem of the interviews like Hathaway, which have been damaged by sitting in the archive.
Run over by the tank.
Yes.
You've told me before that you have either thought about or have written some of the background of your interviews, your adventures of researching. Is that happening? Are you writing about it? Will we ever know the backstory of a lot of that?
I was considering bringing out a volume of memoirs which would include the interviewing that I did in the 60s and then the interviewing that I did in the 70s for the Hollywood series. But in order to tell what really happened, you have to be brutally frank about people, some of whom are still alive, some of whom are dead, but whose families are very sensitive. And I'll just leave it so at least the record is there.
Yeah.
But it's not being exploited.
Are you suggesting, though, that the backstory of your work is every bit as dramatic as the interviews that we now know about?
Yeah, I think some of it certainly was. Some of it certainly was, yes.
Well, place now this moment in time for you as a parent, as a professional person, as an enthusiast. You are still the person you were? Are you continuing to work? Are you looking forward to more leisure time?
I'm too busy to work. I've got too many projects. I'm relieved that there isn't a big documentary. I have to get back on the treadmill, because those things take all day and every day, and some of the weekends as well. Make you very unpopular with your family. So I've at least relaxed from that point of view. I now regard myself as semi-retired, and I can do things like the autobiography. I'm going to catalogue my collection, which is really crucial.
Oh my gosh, yeah.
To find out what's there and why it's important, why I bought it in the first place, which means looking at each one of the films again, which will be fascinating, but will take forever. And today, I don't know what time it is, but any minute now, I have to go over to Jesse Lasky Jr.'s widow, who is going to show me 600 letters written by Jesse Lasky to his son in the silent days, talking about studio life.
This is the Jesse Lasky of the feature the feature play.
That one.
1915 and 16. God.
I know.
The world is our studio. Was that the motto?
I think letters are the next really valuable resource for historians, because they are utterly authentic. They have the amazing information often, and information you couldn't get any other way. And the more can be rescued, the better.
And so these letters have not been available before or known about, or wow,
they're in private hands.
It's amazing they were kept.
Yeah. Well, you would keep letters of your father if he was Jesse Lasky, wouldn't you?
I suppose. Well, you would hope.
Yes.
Tell me about your family. Children, how many?
One.
Okay. And I forget if it's a girl or...
Julia is a girl. She's 22. She's just graduated from Durham University in anthropology.
Anthropology. Good for her.
And she spent her gap year in Africa, and she's now very attached to a project she started to build a secondary school in Tanzania.
Wow.
But she's not in the least interested in films. It doesn't bother me. Don't blame her.
And we don't know that much about Virginia. Has she been a helpmate, partner, editor for you all this time?
She used to, I used to depend on her in the time I worked in America, because I don't drive, and she drove me everywhere and then met all those people. And that was tremendously valuable. And that nearly turned into another project, because coming from Ireland, and when she was young she had flaming red hair, all the Irish Americans would want to know more, and we realized who was Irish American, and it struck me that the Jews ran the business and the Irish made the pictures. It was like the two ghettos side by side from New York. It was incredible how many people. I was going to call the documentary, except nobody wants to back it, I was going to call the documentary Even Adolphe Mongeau Spoke Gaelic.
I love it. Finally, there's must be a new generation now for whom you are like an establishment name. You know, you were the grand old man. We're both near the same age, I can say that. Are they coming to you? Are there new scholars, young scholars coming to you?
Yes, that's why I've got so much work on, because there are all sorts of people working on fascinating things that I have details of in my archive, which I've indexed over the years and can dig out, and which they can expand on. Mm-hmm. And I learn more and more through what they're doing. It's really is a fascinating aspect of it, and it's very annoying when somebody publishes a book on somebody with whom I've got so much material and they never bothered to get in touch, like Mal St. Clair. Got so much stuff on him, but quite often I find things that I never knew I had, which turns out to be valuable, or they identify something which I didn't know what it was, and I didn't know how important it was. That's also fascinating. So that is a great part of being old, is having this contact with the past, this direct contact with the past.
Well, don't you think you did that as a young man for the older scholars and filmmakers? You told them things that they had forgotten, perhaps.
Yeah, possibly.
What they're doing for you, you had done years ago to them.
Well, what I did do is to make the silent film people a bit less self-conscious of their work, that they thought that it was embarrassingly bad, and one could show them how good it was. That was a thrill, and change their mind. I do think that there was an awful prejudice against the silent era, and many of the prints that were shown was shameful and made the technicians of the past look idiots. And since then, we've been able to see what they really look like. And it wasn't the technicians of the past that were the idiots.
Yeah. So last question, do you see something of yourself then in these younger people coming to you now, researching and going out, doing their own research?
Yes, sometimes they're, alas, there is, academe has tainted them to the extent that some of them really do write that language that is totally incomprehensible to man or beast. But that is a great, and some of them have quit because of that. They simply couldn't stand it, and they left a promising career because they simply couldn't bear this nonsense. But we had, I'll just give you one story to end on. We had a young man who saw the version that we did of The Birth of a Nation on Channel 4, and he then saw the D.W. Griffith series, and he said, I want to work in this world. And he came to us when he was at university and said, I'll work for you for nothing. So naturally we could afford that, and he began work for us as a volunteer. And then I discovered that actually as an editor he was better than I was. And he was so good, not only did he edit our films, but he ended up co-directing them. Now we've had to let him go because we've got no work. He's out in the world of television, wasting his talents on things like Mr. Miss World. But he's ready to come back as soon as we get something. And he's earning an enormous amount of money, but he's incredibly talented. And he's also a collector of silent films.
What's his name?
Christopher Bird.
Bird?
Christopher Bird, yes. Absolutely first class. And that was a great thrill to find him. So it's a good moment to end.
Thanks, Kevin.